Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and what's next. It's a show that asks questions and peels back the layers of our average everyday experience and goes beyond scratching the surface. We interview people doing incredible things who are making a difference around the globe. Join me as we listen in and get one step closer to understanding that big ideas shared create collaboration. Collaboration can inspire community, and communities create social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. So my next guest is Lewis Cohen, and he is a writer, producer, director, and we talked about his new series, Truth and Lies. It's airing on TVO. You can see it there, tvo.org, and if you can't access it currently, let's hope and trust it's going to be at a global digital theater soon near you. We talked about a lot of things. I mean, we talked about truth. We talked about lies for sure in the series, and there's 6 episodes, and why it's important that you need to see this. I mean, it's compelling. It's fascinating. It will send shivers up your spine, and you're going to be kind of wondering how it is we got to where we are. We talk about deliberate self-deception. We talk about warnings and history repeating itself, confirmation bias, and about this thing called the age of reason, and just maybe why it wasn't so reasonable after all. We talk about how we learn and about dismantling class divisions. We talk about language and naming as an act of violence. How interesting is that? We talk about meaning and purpose and identity, and about self-interest and the things that motivate us and kind of guide our behavior. We talk about polarization and just overall the power of deception. And what's really fascinating about this series is you come out of it saying, where do we go next? What in this era of fake news and social media, what's next? And I think the for me, the big takeaway was it's about relationships, it's about conversation, it's about dialogue, it's about being open to others in so many different ways. So stay tuned. Coming right up, don't forget my podcasting, writing, and public speaking. You can find more out about that at davidpecklive.com. You can purchase a copy of my book, Real Change is Incremental, and take a look around. There's close to 600 interviews there on the site as well. Face2facelive.ca will get you to the same website. Please leave us a review if you like what we're doing here. We'd love a thumbs up on YouTube. Subscribe to Face to Face wherever you listen to podcasts, and an iTunes review, a sentence or two, Spotify review would be brilliant. We would so appreciate that. But stay tuned for, in my opinion, a fascinating, interesting conversation about deception and media and propaganda, and talking about a new series from TVO called Truth and Lies with Lewis Cohen. My name's David Peck, and you're listening to Face to Face. Well, welcome to Face to Face. We are joined by a very special guest here with us today, Lewis Cohen. He's a writer, director, filmmaker. He's a storyteller. He's here with us today to talk about his new series. I'm going to say important new series, Lewis, Truth and Lies. Thank you for joining us here on Face to Face.
Thanks for saying so, and thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So many questions, by the way, and congratulations on the series, by the way, for those of you we'll be doing this shout out throughout, but it's tvo.org as it sounds. Check it out there. Truth and Lies is the series. It's 6 episodes. Lewis, why don't you give us a little bit of a, kind of an intro into this? And honestly, I've seen 2 episodes, and congrats. It's compelling, it's fascinating, it's interesting, it's super important as far as I'm concerned. I've got about 12 pages of notes here on the first 2 episodes, so
wow.
So buckle up, Lewis.
I'm buckled.
Yeah, excellent. Hey,
the stool has a seatbelt.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, give us a little bit of a high level overview of what we're looking at here, what we're listening to and watching.
Sure, it's a pretty vast enterprise. I mean, Truth and Lies, as the name indicates, is a pretty large subject. I mean, we are, sadly focused on the lies, I'd have to say, the distortions of the truth and so on. And, unfortunately, as we all know, those are, seemingly more legion than ever. And the tools to deliver those lies, to convince us of them, are in a sense more effective and powerful than ever. So that's one of the reasons that this series and the subject feels urgent to me. But one of the real essences of this show is it's not about contemporary politics or culture exclusively. It's a deep dive into the past, and we feel, that the past is filled with great stories, important warnings, and in a sense, this series tries to harness what we know from the past that we can see more clearly because it's further away. The characters are well known. You get that kind of macro vision, that's sort of looking from 30,000 feet at the past, and that some of the patterns that emerge as we look at the past in this series really, hopefully illuminate some of the stuff that we're going through. One of the surprises, I would say, of doing the series, and for those that watch it, I think they'll agree, is that so many of the things that are, contemporary, whether it's conspiracy theories or, malicious social media or war propaganda or influencing, through these technologies, are in fact much older. Right. So that's one of the takeaways for me of the show, is like, it's actually about, it illuminates the present by partly showing how old some of these things are, whether it's war propaganda from ancient Egypt, to conspiracy theories from medieval Europe, to, the sort of influencer trade in the ancient Middle East, as Paul the Apostle got going with his work spreading, Christianity to the pagans. So in all those respects, it's a really interesting blend for me between the past and the present. And the past is fascinating, but we really try and make it relevant by showing how it relates to what we're going through today.
I love what you said about important warnings, and I want to talk about that, because as much as I agree with you, and I think this series is full of warnings, I mean, are we, and I don't like this deterministic question, so there's a presupposition here, Lewis, but are we wired for warnings, or do we really just sort of acquiesce to the status quo? So I'm just going to quote something here before we sort of run through but this just blew my mind. Quote, "The lie," this came out, I think, in the second episode. "The lie in war serves the need of a population that actually wants to be lied to," close quote. That was by, I think, Frank Werner, who's a historian and really focuses on this idea of propaganda and lies. And that just blows me away. So self-deception is front and center. It's kind of disturbing.
It is, yeah, because it really questions, are we even looking for the truth, as the quote suggests,
Do we even care? So it, I mean, warning, well, why, do you know what I mean? Like a warning doesn't matter at that point, because we're not even getting the truth. So anyway, we can go so many places with this, but I found that really disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the special reference there that Frank Werner, you got the guy right, the historian, is talking about, World War One, but of course he could be talking about anything, and the the sort of the importance of having a sense of meaning and purpose and identity trumps truth, right? So understanding, making sense of the fact that all these young men and women are dying, for country. It's really important that these deaths not be considered in vain. I mean, that they not be considered even sort of more, what's the word, senseless than they already are. And so there's this buildup and this belief and this buy-in into the propaganda, because it makes you feel like the sacrifice is worth it. It makes you feel like you're on the right side of history. It makes and so on and so forth. So that's, I think the same thing can be seen weirdly in conspiracy theories. And I had that idea a moment ago, and it's now completely slipped my mind how this related also to conspiracy theories. But anyway, that's for propaganda. It creates that sense of meaning, purpose. Well, I think that are just as important as the sense of truth to our.
Well, let me see if this is maybe where you were going. It seems to me one of the things that I took away from this too, and then one of the episodes, the first episode I watched, by the way, was on conspiracy. I think it's called Conspiracy, and that sense that it creates this. I think this is a direct quote from the film. It creates a narrative that's impossible to doubt. Therefore, it gives us this meta narrative, this grander story to say, oh no, well, this is why we have evil in the world, or this is why particular culture is behaving the way they are, or why they're so violent, and it becomes an act of justification for the violence itself, in a sense. But it brings, like you said, it brings this sense of meaning and purpose almost to the mess we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I mean, it's Michael Butter who is sort of
That's right.
our kind of meta theorist in that episode. The guy, what I call the big thinker, the person who takes us through all the stories, and we have 6 of them in each episode, and and that is his. We talk about a medieval conspiracy theory that he calls a proto-conspiracy theory, but for him, conspiracy theories as we understand them today really emerge in the Enlightenment, and it relates to what you just said, because for him the reason that happens is the Enlightenment is this era where science and reason are starting to displace religion and creed and belief, and that's disturbing. So we have all these will eventually lead to Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead a couple of centuries later, and so on. And so Butter compares conspiracy theories to religion, that it comes in to replace what's being lost with another sense. It's no longer God, but it's the conspirators that are in control of everything. And that, in a sense, even though it's often these evil, destructive plots by these alleged conspirators, the reality is it may be reassuring to be able to point the finger and say there is somebody that in theory we could hold responsible for what's going on, as opposed to, what, there's nobody. This is just sort of human nature, randomness, and everything is sort of run amok. And we're in this complex system in which no one's really in control. That, in a sense, is a much more disturbing thought. That's a world without God. And in a sense, what he's saying is conspiracy theories put God or a God replacement back in the picture, by having these self-sealing, meaningful, systems that you could theoretically understand. Even if they're negative, they're at least graspable.
Exactly right. Even if they're negative, you can still sort of sink your teeth into them in a philosophical or theological or political sense, right? Yeah. And I think what another takeaway from you with the series, which I think you do brilliantly, is just showing us how, and you've already mentioned this, but how deep this goes and how far back it goes. So Michael Butter and talking about what is it in 1144, the Norwich the Norwich Cathedral sort of conspiracy, I guess you could say. I had no idea. I learned a ton, by the way, of what little I've watched. I can't wait to watch the rest of it. There's so much going on here, and you just kind of watch that. You listen to it, and you go, "No, hang on, Lewis. You're twisting the truth here a little bit, aren't you?" As you tell us about Truth and Lies, was it really? You know what I mean? Like you kind of can't believe it. That's this is how this story started.
This is how things seem so stark. Looking back, things seem ridiculous, but in the time, because they're responding to certain like psychological needs, just like
sure.
The fact is, as you talked about, I think before we went live, that you have people within your own orbit that are either conspiracy theorists or in some way. I have the same thing, and I have a close family member who is really believes, and we spoke about this again yesterday, that the election was stolen and that Joe Biden has committed a coup d'etat in the US. And that may look really, really silly in 100 years. But right now, there's tens of millions of Americans that apparently, believe that. And we shouldn't discredit them completely, because, maybe all the evidence isn't in, but also because these are not necessarily stupid people, as also Michael Butter says, that you're not going to write off a third of the population of the US that believes in conspiracy theories. So there's no point. Right. So if one of the advantages to looking to the past is that we get this sort of stark, very clear picture of how things can be seen, as ridiculous and even arguably not credible. Like, did people really believe that? But people, as we know, tens of millions of Americans today are believing things that I think you and I also find, maybe difficult to swallow, but there's enough people believing them. They're obviously responding to some need in the population, to some important psychological. And I think that's what was happening at the time. Right then, in that instance that you brought up, there is, a young boy who's found murdered in the woods outside this, British English town of Norwich. And obviously anytime a child is killed, let alone just dies, it's senseless, horrible.
Sure.
As we see in some of
we
these
need to know what
shootings in the
happened here,
US.
right? Yeah, absolutely.
And there's a priest in the family that blames this on the local Jews. And this this leads eventually a monk. This is discredited by the sheriff. Eventually a new monk is installed at this fairly new cathedral, and he decides to resuscitate this cold case investigation and look into what happened to this young boy, and not comes up with this really rather ludicrous theory that in fact the priest was right and that the Jews of the town had done this for these ritual purposes that remind us a lot of what we're going to later hear in the protocols of the elders of Zion, this notion that
harvesting their blood and so on.
Yes, that exactly that these Jewish communities need to harvest the blood of a child, for different reasons. I mean, this sort of on the famous Passover ritual, or for cosmetic purposes, or for to improve their palate, etc. And I guess this just strikes a chord in the same way that this election denialism in our own day has struck a chord. So you see it being repeated, in places like Brazil, or arguably, to some other extent in Israel and other places throughout the modern polity. This story back then takes off in a viral way as well.
Well, that, Lewis, that's what's so fascinating.
Purpose.
It's like it was the beginning sort of a viral mass media like digital storm in a sense. And there's a comment that, and I forget who it is that you're chatting with at the time, but the story moves into the story of Christianity itself. That's when you start to go, hang on a minute here. The implications are astounding. The implications are far-reaching. They're horrific is what they are. As we see, history has shown how horrific they actually truly are. That's what blew me away, is just how deep these, wow, I don't know if I even want to call them stories,
right?
Because stories have truth in them, right? It seems to me stories point to truth, so that was a bit of a mind-boggling thing for me. Hey, just before I want to come back to this, because I think it's Michael who brings out this idea of how the Enlightenment period, the age of reason is when some of these conspiracy theories really actually start to take hold, and that to me is fascinating. So episodes, so the series is called Truth and Lies. Director, storyteller, writer Lewis Cohen here with us today, by the way, if you haven't already guessed that. And so help me out here. Weapons of War, episode 1, Politics of Religion, Conspiracy, Scandals, The Power of Money, and Influencers. Those are our 6 episodes. Right. You can watch it, folks, on tvo.org, and we hope and trust it's coming soon to some kind of global digital theater near you. So that's kind of where we're at. I just wanted to get that out, and we're like 15 minutes into our conversation, and we're just, I think we're showing our listeners just how much there is here to unpack and to kind of work our way through. And again, thanks for making these films, Lewis. It's an important and compelling piece. So whatever happened to the age of reason? Where did they go so wrong there? Kind of went sideways on this thing called self-deception.
Right. And I sort of spoke about that a little earlier, in the sense that the age of reason sort of destroys our ability to believe, in the stories of Christianity, among other things, and the kind of religious world starts getting picked away at by science, by philosophy, and so on. And so these conspiracy theories, in a weird way at the time, as Michael Butter points out, were in fact the weapons of the church or the royal families running Europe, as a way of saying all these progressive forces. I mean, ironically, the conspiracy theories were against groups like the Freemasons, who in fact were, we kind of maybe have a sense of the Freemasons as this dark secret society.
Right.
The truth is they were, I mean, I that was my sense of them before I ever started doing
same. That's how I was raised. Yeah.
The truth is the Freemasons, I mean, Mozart, we look into his death, which was the subject of a kind of Kurt Cobain-esque conspiracy theory at the time. Was he killed by the Freemasons? He himself was a Freemason. Freemasons were, in fact, the progressive forces of Europe at the time. They were the equivalent of the Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders or the folks throughout the world that are on that side of the political spectrum, and they were all for dismantling class divisions and opening up to. In fact, there were many Freemasons that were involved in the French Revolution. Well, for the people that supported the French monarchy or that supported the Catholic Church, these were real threats. And so this is where we get this notion that the Freemasons are up to no good, that the secret society is plotting against the order as it's been laid out by God, King and God, and so on. So we get into this pattern where conspiracy theories emerge as pro-establishment, anti-progressive forces, and that's how they emerge in that period. And then Michael Butter will talk about how over the centuries they end up flipping and getting used increasingly, by those who are against or suspicious of government and the established power forces.
Right, the elite, as it were.
Yes,
and I find it fascinating too in the Weapons of War episode where the talk of propaganda. I mean, isn't it really? I mean, I couldn't help but see the parallels to lifestyle advertising. And in some respects, the lies that we're told, right? That narrative that, boy, if you got a problem, we can fix it. And isn't that really the age of reason? Isn't that what the Enlightenment Project really was supposedly all about? Doubt all of these things, and eventually you'll be able to know. Eventually you'll know. And yet, ironically, this is where some of the stuff really starts to take hold. Lewis, do you find that this notion of truth and lies? I mean, is it really? Is there a fine line there for you? As you got deeper into the research, as you interviewed more and more experts, when we go to bed at night, how many lies are we actually holding on to? Lies in our relationships, how we parent, how we define love. We just, I mean, there's just so many layers to this and lenses, right? The way we see the world in itself might be a form of lying. I used to work. I hope you find this funny, but I used to work with a dear friend of mine. Bill's his name, and we had a project manager that we used to say, even when he's lying, like he was just so dishonest. But the irony of that is he's actually telling the truth. You got that whole liar's paradox thing going on. But yeah, what is it? Is there a fine line there between that truth and that lies thing?
I mean, that's a good question, and of course you're talking about lies, and the stories we tell ourselves,
right,
about relationships, about our personal life, about what makes things meaningful, about our health, about the world around us.
Health is a huge one.
So sure, I think that in a lot of ways we need. I mean, I'm reminded, not to get too, I don't know, high end about this, but like of Nietzsche once said that like the nature of language is to distort reality because it makes groups. There's this thing called tree. But there are many different kinds of trees, and trees are many things. So that there's this kind of violence in any naming that we do of anything.
Well, it creates a division immediately. You've labeled something. You've now, in a sense, othered it in a way.
Yeah, and you've also sort of turned this infinite number of variations into a single thing.
Right.
So there's a kind of, for the practical purpose of knowing what we're talking about, we've sort of told this lie by using language in itself. So yeah, I would tend to agree that at some fundamental level, there is a very fine line, and that lies are an important part, really, of human survival. Of an ability to process reality in a way that isn't overwhelming. Because I think the truth is so nuanced, so multifaceted, that is probably a lot harder to hold on to or to decipher than lies are. So in that sense, I do think that, this any kind of like easy dichotomy between, I love truth, I hate liars and lies, and I'm on the side of truth is probably, not as simple as that person, might think it is.
It's pretty problematic, it seems to me. I mean, and I would love to chat about this. Is it, and this is a question sort of before, maybe you can answer this one after the next question, but is it about the conversation for you? Is that sort of what comes out of this series? Is that classic question of, what do you want people to take away, because it is so nuanced, this idea of truth and lies. I mean, there's that I've got it written down here somewhere, but you can, right here we go. You can't quote argue with a convinced conspiracy theorist. Well, you can't argue with a convinced religious scholar. You can't argue with a indubitably certain politician, right? I mean, it's
Right.
we're kind of all kind of sort of wired that way, I suppose. There we go with that deterministic language again. But we want solutions. It seems to me we need those answers, even if they're not true. And I think the questions you raise about self-deception are just they're kind of scary. They're more than kind of scary, you
Right.
know. I mean, so that is like one part of it. But what fascinated me too, coming out of the weapons of war episode with propaganda, would the Americans, would the Allies have become a part of the war without those lies that, or at least those versions of those lies that needed to be told in order to whip up that sort of emotive response?
Are you talking about the war in Vietnam, or which war are
Well,
you?
you could pick anyone, but I was
Right.
referring more to World War II in a sense. Try look at the who were actually fighting, just some of the images, and then you've got war photography coming out, and just using that to get people to enlist. You're right. This is who you're
Right.
actually going to be fighting. Look at the
Yeah.
horrors. Look what happened in Belgium. We've, etc.
Yeah. No, I mean, and that was World War One, just to
Oh,
make
I'm
a
sorry. World War One. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, of course, propaganda in World War Two is, has been studied perhaps more. We know a lot more about World War. Anyway,
of
we decided
course.
to focus on World War One in this series because it felt like a little bit less explored. But that's exactly right. I mean, the U.S. was isolationist at the time, was
Yeah,
100% against getting involved in the war,
right.
and that at some level, some of the awful things that the Germans did as they marched into Belgium on their way to France. And there was a long history that I wasn't as aware of before this, series of French-German wars. We hear about the Franco-Prussian wars and
Sure. Yep.
a lot of humiliation and bad blood already built up there over many years. And then they had a lot more trouble getting through Belgium to get to France because that was a less fortified border. That's why they decided to go through Belgium. And they encountered some stiff resistance,
Some
and they started
resistance.
massacring tons of civilians, partly out
Horrifying.
of paranoia, like the
Right.
German
Right.
paranoia that had been installed that there's all these francs-tireurs, these snipers that are civilians. So they just started, slaughtering civilians in the suspicion that they were part of this sort of sniper crews. And then that was based itself on a lie told to the German soldiers to sort of pump them up and
Right.
make them
Right.
vigilant. That leads to another maybe semi-truth, but also distortion, which is, oh my God, these Germans, the stories go from like murdering civilians into raping women, cutting off children's hands, all these just horrible and, unlikely
Sure. Sure.
stories that were spread by the British to try and get both their own people psyched to go to kill these, terrible monsters. I mean, there's all these pictures of sort of King Kong, like
Yeah. Right.
massive
Right.
apes with, women in their hands and they're, grasped in their hands like they are, like the King Kong movie, wearing the German famous war helmet with
Sure.
the
Yep.
pointy top. So these crazy images that were then also sent to the States, and there was a very absolutely, there's no way the US would have been involved in World War One had it not been propagandized and had those stories not been exaggerated, blown up, and transmitted.
And transmitted. I mean, it's sadly we're gonna be wrapping up in a few minutes, but it didn't was it General Schwarzkopf? Wasn't he the guy who did not allow cameras into Iraq? I believe. I mean, basically because of what happened to the Vietnam War and the images. I was stunned to find out where's the number. In 1964, 40 journalists in Vietnam. By 1966, over 282 journalists covering the war. I mean, we don't even need to talk about propaganda. We just got to, how do you, and now fast forward to Instagram and Twitter and TikTok and so on. How do you filter? And so crazy question for you, but what do you learn from this? What's the takeaway for you? I mean, this truth lies, this fake news world we live in. And I mean, I was reading yesterday that apparently, according to people are using images coming out of Turkey and Syria with the earthquake. They're using AI software now to create these emotive images that aren't real to raise money for projects that don't even exist. So we're not talking about like the Red Cross using AI software to create these images. We're just talking about people on TikTok trying to steal your money. But they're making
Right.
these images with AIs, like they aren't even real images, is what I'm
Right.
saying. And you go, there's a layer of
They're not even
self-deception.
images, and they're not even real charities. Is what it sounds
They're
like to me. It's
not
like,
real charities. You want to talk about self-deception, right? I mean,
I
wow.
know.
Do your research, I guess, is one of the takeaways. But I don't want to oversimplify what you've done here with this beautiful, brilliant series. But yeah, what's are you
Yeah, I
just
mean,
like are you a big raving cynic now, Lewis? Is that what
I think I was a big raving cynic before I got involved. I think it's one of the reasons I was the right person to
you were
take
the
on the
right guy for
subject.
the job? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot of faith that people left to their own devices, or even when we try and control people,
Right.
forget about left to their own devices, that they will do the right thing. I mean, I think there's an
Right.
incredible amount of self-interest, often dressed up as something else, that motivates and guides behavior. I mean, I'm probably changing subjects at some
Oh, go
level.
for it.
One of the interesting versions of that again is sort of made clear through history, through that long lens that we can look back. The 30 Years' War, which was an incredibly violent, in a weird way, the first modern war, and it takes place obviously in Europe. It's at some level between the Protestants and Catholics. It's just 100 years after Martin Luther has launched the Protestant Revolution, and there's this pushback against the Protestants by the Habsburgs, and this guy comes in from Sweden,
right,
saying, "I'm coming to rescue my Protestant brethren on the continent," and he's gets the propaganda pushes him as the Lion of the North, the Swedish king, a Protestant gentleman, Gustav Adolf, and does, but really all he's going to, and he plays this massive,
sure,
which is even touching at a distance, even knowing it was a lie.
Right, which is fascinating.
Feels like this incredible act of solidarity, kind of like what you're talking about. But in fact, he just saw an opportunity to grab territory, and it was really a territorial strategic war for Sweden. And in fact, we don't think of Sweden as a very imperial country, but they actually took territory all along the northern coast of Germany, Lithuania, throughout Northern Europe, and held it for the next 100 years. And that was the real purpose, but being framed in this completely.
Well, it's layered lies upon layered lies. It's really is fascinating. And what's also really incredible there to me as well, makes perfect sense, the printing press. All of a sudden, Heidelberg, things change as a result.
That's why it's considered the first modern war, because you have newspapers emerge. I mean, the printing press was invented, but before you actually had a printing industry, it took a little while. So early 1600s, when this 30 Years' War breaks out, you've got newspapers, and for the first time, you have this kind of real-time line that's going on while the battle's going on, as opposed to the first story we look at in ancient Egypt, where it takes several years to create the lie in these engravings. So I mean, that's one of the things that's been consistent is this lie, is the manipulation of truth to achieve certain ends, trying to get people to buy in for their own reasons, psychologically, and so on. And then at the same time, what's been changing, which you've alluded to, is the technology that we have to deliver it.
With the speed,
so at one point, you're carving things into stone and it takes several years. At another point, you're doing a deep fake that takes several seconds or actually several milliseconds. So, you're in a completely different scale now. And that's what's really scary. And that's one of the takeaways, is that, it's kind of like Albert Einstein, Adam Einstein.
Adam Einstein, I know him well.
You know Adam Einstein, but anyway, his great grandfather Albert. So the Albert Einstein, said something like, he was concerned that this great power of nuclear weapons was in the hands of people who were even really not able to handle guns properly. And it's the same kind of thing, that we have the same nature that's been going on since ancient times, but suddenly we've got the deep fakes, we've got ChatGPT, the power of deception and the ability to spread it everywhere. That's kind of the double thesis of the series. On the one hand, wow, this stuff's been going on forever. And on the other hand, we're shooting forward into unprecedented.
Well, on one level, and I'm going for the cheap laugh here, but we're kind of screwed, right?
Okay, I missed the laugh part. I'm not. Was there a double entendre on Screwed?
Well, no, I mean, in a sense, I mean, deep fakes, fake news, milliseconds. I mean, how can we ever possibly know? And yet we have instant images coming out of Turkey and Syria that are heartbreaking, that are helping to raise money. So you've got this sort of, I guess the question, maybe we end with this. Let's end with this. And sadly, I think we need a part 2 for sure, Lewis. But how do we clean the lens every day? How do we make sure that what we're seeing is it about triangulation, like have 3 different sources that you get your news from? Is it about having engaging conversations with people like yourself, like make sure you're watching?
Right. Those are good strategies. I mean, strategy of triangulation is like often when, we were looking at like Trump, State of the Union address or what have you, and
right.
you'd be, following along with the fact checkers in the New York Times, just trying to keep up.
Right.
But, I mean, at some level, you got to have a willing population willing to read that stuff and to triangulate. And that's harder to achieve. I mean, it's like Emerson Brooking, one of the scholars that we were looking at in the Ward episode, talked about, and I don't want to get the quote wrong, but he said something about the fact that, getting the story out there and sort of infecting the landscape with a lie is so effective, because even if you go and clean it up after, it's too late.
It's too late.
In some important way, the news cycle is so fast.
Yeah.
So it's not clear to me. Obviously, it is really the $1 billion question. I mean, it used to be the $1 million question, but hey, inflation and social media has made it the $1 billion question. Is how do we restore something like rationality, reason,
rationality,
and reason into our landscape?
Rationality, how's this? Rationality, reason, and relationship. Because I think that has to be front and center, that you and I can disagree and hopefully still have a drink later tonight together. And right? We can still be friends. We can still have a conversation and say, you know what, Lewis, I think you're a little nuts on that one, but you know what? You've made me open to something that I've never seen before. Like, I mean, for me, it's Socratic dialogue. It's a great conversation over dinner. But boy, the world is not operating that way currently. And
it reminds me of my next project, which we don't have to discuss. But
no, please, well, this is a great way to wrap up our.
No, because it's about political polarization, right?
There you go.
This theater troupe called Port Parole from Montreal, as they've gone, to Toronto, down to the U.S. outside Washington D.C. and over to Munich, trying to do these documentary plays about political polarization in these different communities, and ask that exact question: how is it that we can still talk to each other? And so there's gathering around a table. And I can tell you from, the research done through this very microcosm of this theater project, it is not easy.
No,
and in fact, in some ways, the documentary is about how the group trying to create the conversation can't even have a conversation themselves. And
I was just going to say, okay, let's wrap it up with, well, isn't it about a commitment to the truth? Well, sure. But what does that even mean if my question or my statement is framed on a 500 years of lies,
right.
or whatever, or maybe even just 5 weeks of lies? So, wow, you've posed a huge problem. You've done it in a super interesting way. The series is called Truth and Lies. It's on TVO. You can get to it tvo.org. 6 episodes. Really. Oh, wow. I don't like using the word entertaining when it comes to topics like this, but it is entertaining. It clips along. And like I said, Lewis, I learned a ton. Thank you so much for the series and for the film and for being with us here today on Face to Face. We've been having a very, I would say, a very deep conversation, scratching the surface on some levels here today on Face to Face with Lewis Cohen. Thank you so much, Lewis, for joining us today on Face
Thanks, David. Really appreciate being here and having the chat.
So there you have it, my conversation with Lewis Cohen. We had a great time, at least I did. I had a great time, a fun time talking about Truth and Lies, a new TVO series that you can watch online, tvo.org, coming soon to a global digital theater near you. Lewis and I connected on propaganda and media and social media and truth and lies and and what it means, this thing called the politics of power, and what does it mean to really dig deep and to peel back the layers. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Check out the film. It's fascinating. It's compelling. It's a very, I think it's an important series and one that needs to be watched, and I hope watched by many. Don't forget davidpecklive.com for more information about what I do, my writing and my speaking and my podcasting. Over 600 interviews there to choose from. We've been doing this now for, I guess I'm in my 9th year. That's a lot of conversations. Check them out. Some fascinating, I think fascinating news coming up in the not so distant future. And please leave us a review. I would so appreciate if you left a review for our podcast on iTunes or Spotify, and subscribe wherever you listen. And if you're watching / listening to us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to it there. But please, a review would go a long way. And then socially mediate us in any way possible. Thank you so much for listening. My name is David Peck, and this is Face to Face.